Hello, I'm your host Tinfoil Tom, and today we're going to the Bermuda Triangle in search of Flight 19. Thinking back, way back, there was a time that I didn't even know about mysteries and conspiracies. Yeah, a simpler time. A time without... Aw, come on, that's rude. How old do you think I am? Bring me to the 90s, alright? While watching television one fateful evening with my family, I saw an episode of a show that would change the course of my life forever and turn me into the investigator I am today. That show, you might ask? Unsolved freaking mysteries. Specifically, an episode about a lost squadron of World War II era aircraft that seemingly vanished into thin air while on a routine training mission through none other than the Bermuda Triangle. But what really happened to this flight? Flight 19? Well, to get to the bottom of this mystery, let's start at the beginning. But, and this is a big juicy but, before we dive deep into the waters of the Bermuda Triangle, I will ask that you kindly investigate the like button, and if you find it, hit it repeatedly and leave a comment below with your favorite mystery. Now, back to Flight 19. December 5th, 1945. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor had recently transferred to the Naval Training Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. After the end of World War II, he wasn't sure what he wanted to do after the war, but he loved to fly. And, by all accounts, he was a daring and skilled pilot, although he was considered a bit reckless. Kind of a hotshot. I picture a kinda Maverick from Top Gun type. Just a real dreamy... I mean, focus, Tinfoil Tom. Focus. The point I'm trying to make here is that he was a skilled pilot who had seen his fair share of combat missions during World War II, serving in the Pacific as part of Task Force 38. Mainly conducting bombing runs near Okinawa. He had logged over 2,500 hours of flight time prior to the events of December 5th, with over 600 of those hours in the TBM Avenger, the planes for which he was an instructor of on the base for training. It should be noted that as part of his record, he had previously ditched twice and crash-landed on both occasions. Not entirely uncommon during the war, but he did have a reputation as a fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants type of pilot. He was well liked by his peers, and a capable pilot and instructor, regardless of that reputation though. Taylor's training group of 13 men arrived in the early afternoon hours of December 5th, ready to take part in what they thought was a routine bombing exercise off the coast of Florida. But Lieutenant Taylor was nowhere to be found. When he did arrive, he promptly went to the office of the aviation duty officer, Lieutenant Arthur Curtis, and asked to be relieved of his duties for the day. When pressed, Taylor didn't offer a reason for his request, and was told he had to conduct the training exercise. And his request to be grounded was denied. I believe that this mistake was the first of many mistakes made by the Navy and by Taylor, but more on that later. Flight 19 had a date with destiny. The training squadron was comprised of both Navy and Marine personnel, with each of the 5 TBM Avenger bombers comprised of a group of 3 men, a pilot, a gunner, and a radio operator who also served as bombardier. One of the planes was down a man on this particular flight, so all told, 14 men would be participating in the exercise in 5 total aircraft, with Taylor in command. Although of note is that although Taylor was in charge, he was not the highest ranking officer that day, as Edward Powers, one of the training pilots, was actually a captain. The average hours logged with the group was about 300 hours of flight time, and they were mostly all due to graduate from training school very shortly. This was a fairly experienced group, and looking at the records, should have been more than capable of completing this routine training run. The group lifted off about 20 minutes later than the scheduled departure time into fair weather conditions, with about 5 hours of fuel, much more than enough to safely make the bombing run and return to base in Fort Lauderdale. This mission was intended to teach the pilots how to properly utilize something known as dead reckoning, or simply navigating, among other things, by time. So pilots were generally required to wear a wristwatch in addition to the navigational equipment aboard the aircraft to help them determine course and position. And their target that day? Hen and Chicken Shoals, a reef off the coast of Florida, near the Bahamas. This was intended to be a fairly short hop, with the group led by a student pilot, presumably Captain Powers, and Lieutenant Taylor supervising from the rear of the group in his plane. Taking off from Florida, going east, dropping bombs on the shoals, heading north, then finally turning west back towards the coast and returning to the base before an expected turn of the weather later in the afternoon. So, in the shape of a triangle, one might say. A Bermuda Triangle. From the initial radio chatter back to base, everything seemed fine. The bombers dropped their bombs. Then, something became off. Around 3:40 p.m., another instructor out of Fort Lauderdale, Lieutenant Robert Cox, heard Lieutenant Taylor over the radio say something to Captain Powers. Quote, "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." End quote. After some back and forth, an increasingly concerned Cox, who had made contact by this point, got a reply that made very little sense from Taylor. Quote, "Both my compasses are out, and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it's broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." End quote. This was absolutely puzzling. Taylor had apparently taken the lead back from the students and believed he was somewhere over the Florida Keys, over 100 miles south and west from where they were last positioned. This was simply not possible. Even so, Cox instructed Taylor to fly with the sun towards his port wing, something any flyer should know. Following that direction, even if the instruments were out, the group would undoubtedly hit land soon. By this point, the naval station in Fort Lauderdale became involved as the flight had been identified as Flight 19. Cox began flying towards what he believed the group's position to be and offer assistance, as it was entirely clear Taylor was impossibly lost and something was very wrong. The air station and Cox desperately attempted to communicate with Taylor, who either didn't hear all the radio messages due to radio interference or was bafflingly choosing to ignore them. Whatever the case, Cox radioed Taylor and said, quote, "Have a wingman with a good compass take over lead of flight," end quote. But it was clear the radio signal was growing more distant, and eventually Cox had to return to base. Did Taylor even hear him? Cox had also been flying in the wrong direction to meet Taylor based on where Taylor had told him they were. Another costly mistake. Lieutenant Cox later said, quote, "As his transmissions were fading, he must have been going away north as I headed south. I believe at the time of his first transmission, he was either over the Biminis or Bahamas. I was about 40 miles south of Fort Lauderdale and couldn't hear him any longer." End quote. As the confused Taylor led the group further and further out to sea, the other pilots in the group, most likely Captain Powers, were overheard through increasingly weak radio transmissions saying, quote, "Damn it, if we would just fly west, we would get home." End quote. It was clear to the other pilots, or at least Powers, Taylor was leading them astray and into certain death. Around this time, they were picked up by another radio station and were now some 120 miles from the Florida coast, somewhere near Daytona Beach. But unfortunately, a message providing them this information either couldn't or wasn't relayed to Flight 19. This was around 6 p.m. The sun was setting, and unless the group was able to make it back soon, they would run out of fuel and crash into the Atlantic Ocean. The weather had also shifted from fair to rough, and a crash landing at sea would seal their doom. The odds of surviving in the open ocean in rough weather is almost zero. It was beginning to look grim. At some point, it is believed that Taylor actually did listen to Powers, and around this time, the group headed west, the correct direction, for about 45 minutes until faint radio chatter was heard and Taylor said, quote, "I suggest we fly due east until we run out of gas. We have a better chance of being picked up close to shore. If we were near land, we should be able to see a light or something. Are you listening?" End quote. This would prove to be Taylor's final and greatest mistake. Taylor believed by this point the group was flying somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, or the exact opposite direction of where they were. The group is believed to have then turned east once again and headed further out over the unforgiving sea and into open waters, when, at around 6:30 p.m., a chilling message of, quote, "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." End quote. That message from Flight 19 was the last time anyone ever heard from anyone from Flight 19 again. So what happened? Well, for starters, I don't believe Taylor should have flown that day. He had requested to be grounded for whatever reason. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he had a feeling. Whatever the case, he was off. It is also generally believed Lieutenant Taylor had forgotten his wristwatch. something critical to navigating by dead reckoning, and it also had some sort of failure with his navigational equipment. In a panic, Taylor, who had aforementioned tendencies to ditch his aircraft, became impossibly lost, grew increasingly panicked, and, not listening to the protests of his crew, continued to lead them out to sea, believing he was over the Florida Keys and the Gulf of Mexico, when in actuality he was most likely north, over a series of small islands near Apico Island, which looks a lot like the Florida Keys, and then over open water. It would seem Taylor initially flew northwest, thinking he was headed west, parallel to the Florida coast. Thought he had flown southwest, turned west, and then due east, impossibly lost and confused, dooming himself and his crew. The vastness of the open ocean made it almost impossible to find any surviving crew, and tragically, they were most likely swallowed up by poor weather conditions and stormy seas sometime during the evening hours of December 5th. If he had simply listened to Powers and stayed the course, they would have certainly made landfall and returned safely to base. There is some strangeness, though. 2 PBM Mariner flying boats were sent to locate Flight 19, with one of them completely vanishing near the last known radar location of the doomed patrol. None of the 13 crew aboard the Mariner were ever seen or heard from again, and no distress call was heard. The tanker, SS Gaines Mills, reported seeing an explosion in the general vicinity of where the plane disappeared, and although they did discover what appeared to be aviation oil and gasoline on the surface of the water, no sign of the wreckage or crew was ever seen. The official report states that the Mariner most likely exploded, bringing the final total of missing aviators to 27. And what about Taylor's request to be dismissed from duty and grounded? Some say he had a premonition prior to the flight, while others say he may have been sick or hungover. It is very odd that on the day the entire crew vanished, along with the search plane, he felt the need to be grounded. Finally, in 1962, a local judge, Graham Stikelether, discovered what appeared to be a downed TBM Avenger while hunting near the coast in Florida. Shockingly, 2 bodies were still inside the aircraft. When he notified the authorities, he was allegedly told it was a plane from Flight 19. It can be presumed then that Captain Powers, the pilot who had disagreed with Taylor over the radio and was technically ranking officer on the flight, had continued west instead of going east with Taylor and the others, and unfortunately had perished when he crash landed. Later requests to the Navy to confirm the identity of the crew and aircraft were denied. Was the plane Powers? Or was it another unfortunate pair of souls? Why conceal this information from the public? Also, what about the third man on Powers' Avenger? If it was indeed Powers, where was the missing crewman? It is possible it was Sergeant George Pianessa, a member of his crew. Shortly after Flight 19 vanished, a telegram arrived at Pianessa's family's home with the cryptic message reading, quote, "You've been misinformed about me. Am very much alive." End quote. It was signed by Georgie, which was a nickname only his family called him. Could Sergeant Pianessa have survived only to have gone AWOL? Georgie was never heard from again, but is it really that much of a stretch to think that a young, panicked aviator went AWOL after suffering such an ordeal? It certainly was a lot more possible back then to go off the grid. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the possibility that Flight 19 experienced something while flying through the area known as the Bermuda Triangle, but not anything supernatural. Rather, something strange, bizarre, and mysterious that was produced by nature itself. Many reports of magnetic fluctuations in the area affecting other vessels could have affected the aircraft's instruments, throwing them wildly off course, or perhaps even a freak weather anomaly affected their ability to navigate. Everything from UFOs to time distortions have been thrown around over the years regarding Flight 19. But if we go down that road, we'll have to do so in another episode. The official report from the Navy leaves this case unsolved, and the cause of the missing aircraft is still unknown. Whatever you think about Flight 19, it is a tragic tale that so many young men lost their lives, and they should be remembered as heroes. In the years that followed, authors and even filmmakers like Steven Spielberg have sought to capitalize on the events, with wild theories like UFO abductions to weapons from Atlantis to temporal time distortions and everything in between being responsible for the missing aircraft. While I do believe anything is possible, and who knows, maybe it was them aliens, I believe, like any good legend, this one has just enough weirdness to make it spicy and not enough answers to make anything seem possible. And to a 6-year-old tinfoil Tom watching Unsolved Mysteries way back in the past, hearing the stories of monsters and aliens and magic swallowing up 27 soldiers made me believe anything could be possible. I still believe that to this day. Thank you for everything, Robert Stack. I hope you liked this one, and until next time, I've been your host, Tinfoil Tom, saying, I'm ready to believe you.